Have you ever had that unsettling feeling that something isn't quite right? That beneath the surface of your daily life, your choices, your desires, your ambitions, lies a system of control so perfectly designed you can't even see its edges? You're not paranoid. You're waking up. What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, invisible forces are shaping your thoughts, redirecting your desires, and quietly defining the boundaries of what you believe is possible? That the freedom you cherish is actually an elaborate illusion, a cage so perfectly designed that you've mistaken its bars for the horizon? Friedrich Nietzsche, that notorious 19th century philosopher with the magnificent mustache, warned us about a particular danger. A red flag so subtle yet so pervasive that it has become the water in which we swim. He saw it coming over a century ago, but its modern manifestation is far more sophisticated, far more insidious than even he could have imagined. You believe you're making choices. You believe you're exercising free will. But what if those very beliefs are the most effective chains ever forged? Today, we're venturing into the shadows of the mind, where manipulation happens not through crude coercion, but through the gentle guidance of desires you never chose to have, where control isn't maintained through force, but through the careful cultivation of who you believe yourself to be. This isn't conspiracy, this is philosophy, this is psychology, this is the reality that true power never announces itself, it simply makes alternatives unthinkable. To understand how deeply manipulation penetrates our lives, we need to understand Friedrich Nietzsche's revolutionary insights. Nietzsche wasn't just another philosopher. He was a prophet of modernity, a diagnostician who dissected the hidden power structures beneath our most cherished beliefs. Let's start with his most fundamental concept, the will to power. Contrary to popular misunderstanding, this isn't merely about dominating others. Nietzsche saw the will to power as the primary driving force in humans, the impulse not just to survive, but to expand, to overcome resistance, to reshape reality according to one's values. In the beginning was not the word, Nietzsche might say, but the will to power. But here's the crucial insight. This will to power doesn't always express itself honestly. It disguises itself. It wears masks. And its most effective disguise is morality itself. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche performs what he calls a genealogical critique, tracing how our moral values emerged not from some divine command or universal reason, but from specific power dynamics throughout history. He distinguishes between master morality and slave morality. Master morality, according to Nietzsche, emerges from strength and affirms life. It values traits like courage, pride, and honesty. Slave morality, by contrast, emerges from weakness and resentment, what Nietzsche calls ressentiment. Unable to express power directly, the weak invent moral systems that condemn the strong, transforming their own impotence into a virtue. What if a symptom of regression were inherent in the good, Nietzsche asks, likewise a danger, a seduction, a poison, a narcotic, through which the present was possibly living at the expense of the future? This is Nietzsche's first red flag. When power disguises itself as morality, as common sense, as the way things are. When those who benefit from existing arrangements convince everyone else that these arrangements are natural, inevitable, or morally necessary. Consider his words from Beyond Good and Evil. Everything that elevates an individual above the herd and intimidates the neighbor is henceforth called evil. The values we hold most dear, humility, selflessness, conformity, might themselves be subtle tools of control, designed not to liberate, but to domesticate. This domestication reaches its pinnacle in what Nietzsche calls the last man, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The human being so thoroughly conditioned that they no longer even desire freedom or greatness. They want comfort, security, entertainment, the absence of pain rather than the presence of joy. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. Sound familiar? Nietzsche also identified another mechanism of control, what he called the herd instinct. Humans naturally seek belonging and conformity. We're social animals who fear ostracism more than almost anything else. This makes us extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation through group dynamics. Madness is rare in individuals, Nietzsche observed, but in groups, parties, nations, and ages, it is the rule. This herd instinct doesn't just influence our behavior, it shapes our very perception of reality. We see what we're conditioned to see. We think what we're permitted to think. The boundaries of acceptable thought become invisible to us, not because they don't exist, but because we've internalized them so completely. Perhaps most presciently, Nietzsche understood that language isn't neutral. It's the primary battlefield where reality is defined. I fear we are not getting rid of God because we still believe in grammar, he wrote, understanding that the very structure of our language shapes what we can conceive. Words aren't just tools for communication, they're tools for control. They don't just describe reality, they create it. By controlling the language available to us, power systems control what can be thought, what can be questioned, what can be imagined. This leads us to Nietzsche's concept of perspectivism, the idea that there is no single, objective viewpoint, but rather many perspectives, each shaped by particular values and interests. There are no facts, only interpretations, he famously wrote. This doesn't mean all perspectives are equally valid. Some are more life-affirming, more honest, more conducive to human flourishing. But it does mean that whenever someone claims to speak from a position of pure objectivity free, from all bias and interest, they are engaging in what Nietzsche would call the will to truth, which is itself a disguised will to power. The final piece of Nietzsche's philosophical warning concerns nihilism, the collapse of meaning that follows when traditional values no longer hold sway. Nietzsche announced that God is dead, meaning not just that religious belief was declining, but that the entire framework of meaning that had structured Western civilization was crumbling. In this vacuum, Nietzsche foresaw new forms of control emerging, not through traditional authority, but through more subtle means. Without strong values of our own, we become vulnerable to manipulation by systems that offer pre-packaged meaning, identity, and purpose. The truly free human being, for Nietzsche, is not the one who escapes all influence and impossibility, but the one who creates values rather than merely inheriting them. This is the Übermensch, or overman, not a superior being in the sense of dominating others, but one who has overcome the gravitational pull of herd thinking to forge an authentic path. With these philosophical tools in hand, let's turn to our present reality and see Nietzsche's red flags waving frantically all around us. Today's manipulation doesn't wear a uniform or wave a flag. It doesn't need to. It's embedded in the architecture of our daily lives, operating through systems so familiar we've stopped noticing them. Consider social media. Those seemingly innocent platforms that connect us. Behind their sleek interfaces lies what Nietzsche would recognize instantly as a machine for harnessing the herd instinct. The dopamine hit of likes, the fear of missing out, the carefully curated personas we construct. All of these tap into ancient tribal dynamics while creating unprecedented forms of soft control. These platforms aren't merely reflecting our desires, they're actively shaping them. Each algorithm is a value system in disguise, determining what information reaches you, what emotions are amplified, what behaviors are rewarded. This isn't conspiracy, it's business. And it works precisely because it doesn't feel like control. The average person now touches their phone 2,617 times per day. Each interaction isn't just a momentary distraction. It's an opportunity for reconditioning, for subtle shifts in desire and identity. The phone isn't just a tool we use. Increasingly, we are tools used by our devices and the systems behind them. When you scroll through your feed, you believe you're consuming content. In reality, you are the content being consumed. Your attention, your emotional reactions, your behavioral patterns. These are the actual products being harvested, analyzed, and sold. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product doesn't go far enough. Even when you are paying, you're still the product. The service is merely the bait. This is what Nietzsche might call the most dangerous game, not just the control of bodies or behaviors, but the colonization of consciousness itself. The frontier of power is no longer external, but internal. Nietzsche spoke of how Christianity made people interesting by giving them a sense of deep inner conflict sin versus salvation, flesh versus spirit. Today's marketing accomplishes something similar by creating artificial problems that only consumption can solve. You're not just buying products, you're buying identities, stories about yourself, temporary relief from anxieties that were manufactured in the first place. Each advertisement whispers, "You are insufficient, but this will complete you." Consider how often our desires shift in perfect alignment with market offerings. How convenient that what we need is always what's being sold. How strange that our vision of the good life so precisely matches what the economy requires us to be. Voracious consumers, defined by what we purchase rather than what we create. Nietzsche would see this as a masterful inversion. Instead of products serving human needs, humans are reshaped to serve product needs. The will to power of economic systems expresses itself by redirecting our own will to power into safe, profitable channels. When you click Accept Cookies without thinking, you're handing over more than just data. You're handing over your autonomy. You're allowing your future desires to be shaped by past behaviors, creating a feedback loop of narrowing possibility. The language of control. Today's manipulation operates through language with surgical precision. Consider how certain words function not to communicate, but to stop thought in its tracks. Call something problematic, and watch how it places the burden of proof on the defender rather than the accuser. Label a perspective harmful and observe how it bypasses rational argument entirely. Invoke common sense to disguise cultural assumptions as universal truths. These linguistic mechanisms don't just win arguments, they make certain positions unspeakable, unthinkable. They create boundaries of acceptable thought that feel natural rather than imposed. Even more subtly, observe how the language of liberation and authenticity has been weaponized. Express yourself becomes consume in this particular way. Find your truth becomes adopt this prefabricated identity. Follow your passion becomes work longer hours for less security. As Nietzsche would recognize, the most effective chains are those we mistake for wings. Another manifestation of modern manipulation centers on identity, perhaps the most intimate territory for the exercise of power. Nietzsche understood that people will accept almost any what if they're given a compelling why, a sense of meaning and purpose. Today's sophisticated systems don't just sell products or ideas, they sell identities, complete with ready-made values, aesthetics, and communities. Political movements, consumer brands, online communities all offer the intoxicating promise of belonging, of being part of something larger than oneself. This isn't inherently manipulative. Humans are social creatures who naturally seek tribe and purpose. The manipulation emerges when these identities become closed systems, when they create impermeable boundaries between us and them, when they make questioning of group assumptions taboo, when they replace the difficult work of becoming with the easier comfort of belonging. Watch how quickly disagreement becomes betrayal in identity-based communities, how questioning becomes heresy, how nuance becomes treason. These are the warning signs of a will to power that operates not through freedom, but through its constriction. Perhaps the most masterful form of modern control is the simulation of choice. We're surrounded by options, political parties, consumer products, lifestyle brands, streaming content. Yet the parameters of these choices are narrowly defined. Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence challenges us to consider whether we would choose to live our lives over and over again for eternity. It's a thought experiment designed to confront us with the weight of our choices. But in a world where choices are pre-packaged, where alternatives are systematically removed from view, how can we truly exercise what Nietzsche would call the will to power in its most personal sense? Consider how political discourse presents itself as a battlefield of ideas while operating within remarkably narrow boundaries. Fundamental questions about power, property, or purpose are replaced with superficial distinctions that give the appearance of significant choice while preserving underlying structures. This isn't the result of a smoke-filled room of conspirators. It's the natural outcome of systems that benefit from presenting the status quo as the only realistic possibility. One final mechanism of manipulation that Nietzsche would immediately recognize is what we might call therapeutic governance, the redefinition of political and social problems as individual psychological issues. When structural problems are reframed as personal failings, the solution becomes not changing the system, but adjusting oneself to it. Feeling exploited at work? Practice mindfulness. Crushed by debt? Learn financial literacy. Alienated by modern life? Seek therapy. None of these responses are inherently wrong, but their cumulative effect is to redirect potentially transformative energies inward rather than outward. The problem is never the system. It's always your reaction to the system. This is a sophisticated evolution of what Nietzsche called slave morality, turning impotence into virtue, making a moral good out of what is actually a forced adjustment to power. The most common lie, Nietzsche wrote, is that which one lies to oneself. Lying to others is relatively an exception. Today's most effective manipulation doesn't force us to believe falsehoods. It encourages us to lie to ourselves, to mistake adaptation for freedom, compliance for choice, adjustment for growth. If we are surrounded by such sophisticated forms of control, what hope is there for genuine freedom? Here, Nietzsche offers not comfort, but challenge, not easy answers, but a demanding path. First, we must recognize that complete escape from influence is neither possible nor desirable. Nietzsche wasn't advocating for some fantasy of pure individualism or total self-creation. We are always shaped by forces beyond ourselves, by history, language, culture, biology. The question isn't whether we'll be influenced, but how consciously we'll participate in that influence, whether we'll curate it according to values we've examined or passively absorb whatever we're exposed to. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch isn't about superiority over others, but mastery over oneself. It represents the human being who creates values rather than merely inheriting them, who takes responsibility for shaping meaning in a world without given answers. This begins with what Nietzsche calls the most difficult thought, genuine self-examination. Not the superficial self-knowledge promoted by personality tests or social media profiles, but the courage to question our most cherished beliefs, to ask which of our desires are truly our own and which have been implanted. In practical terms, this means developing what Nietzsche might call the second gaze, the ability to observe not just content, but its framing, not just information, but its selection, not just what captures your attention, but the mechanisms by which that capture occurs. It means practicing what he calls active forgetting, the deliberate setting aside of inherited values and assumptions. This isn't ignorance, but the creation of space in which new thoughts become possible. It means cultivating what Nietzsche calls solitude, not mere physical isolation, but the psychological capacity to stand apart from collective certainties, to think thoughts that aren't pre-approved.